Across all of time and space, one universal constant has remained true. Elves are simply built better than everyone else. Long-lived, magical, beautiful, elves truly are better than anyone else. Except the Mer of the Elder Scrolls, who should be treated with the same respect one gives our particularly disgusting cockroach. But as for the rest of the elves, they're great, and they have a pantheon that, all around, can be considered pretty great as well. Now I must confess to you here that I don't think the elf gods are quite as supreme as beings like Nagash, or of course Balthasar Gelt, who is not a god but is supreme. But they're of course far better than the Chaos gods, and you better believe that I'm putting their gods above the Emperor of Mankind. Across the heavens do the Warhammer elf gods dictate the flow of the world, sending prophecies, great storms, and raising up great heroes to bring forth their will to the material world. And even better for me than yapping about elves is not shooting my analytics in the foot, because the elven gods, with one or two exceptions, are all the same as the Eldar gods, which means I can make this a 40K video too. Be you space elf or just regular elf, the gods of the elves can be found in any Warhammer setting. They can even be found in Age of Sigmar in some small ways, such as the influence and longevity of even the weakest elven gods. So today, let's discuss them, or at least the nicer ones that exist. The Elfdar Gods of Warhammer, be they devoured whole, slain outright, or still lingering on influencing the world in one way or another. But before I begin, tell me, are you perhaps feeling a bit peckish? Want a quick bite to eat but the day's been too long to cook? Then allow me to introduce you to Factor, the sponsor of this video. Factor is the premier meal delivery service that sends chef-crafted and dietitian-approved meals straight to your front door. Cooking is something everyone should learn, but some days you just don't have the time or energy. Be it a long day at work, extra errands to run, or any one of a million reasons, maybe cooking just isn't on the table. Have no fear, for Factor is here. Just pop it in the microwave for 2 minutes and bam, instant good food ready to be eaten. And for those of you with particular eating goals, it's great for that too. You can pick from a variety of choices for your meals to suit your needs. Calorie smart, high protein, low carb, anything you need from your eating habits can be helped perfectly by Factor. As always, I enjoy a nice Factor meal in the middle of the night. I don't really feel like starting to cook at midnight, but unfortunately I do need to eat, and so Factor's perfect for me. If all this sounds appetizing to you, God I'm clever, then look no further. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code PANCREASFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. That's code PANCREASFB50 at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and a qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchase. If you need a good and easy bite to eat, there's no better choice than Factor, so get yourself some today for some good eating. Now then, give praise to Asurian and pass the shuriken ammunition. Though the distinction isn't much made in 40k since the Eldar Pantheon's lore almost to a man ends with "and then Slaanesh ate them," there are two distinctions to be made in the kind of elf gods that exist. For this video, I'll be going over the nicer gods they have. Nicer being the operative word, not nice. Never nice in Warhammer. This is the term for the good gods. Now we do speak in terms of good in the same way we might say Zeus is good. He will still smite your ass if you don't offer proper prayer. But as a rule of thumb, the High Elves are more than happy to worship this brand of god, and in turn, the Kadai tend to grant them blessings, boons, or at least do the bare minimum in regards to keeping Ulthuan safe. At least some of the High Elf gods per End Times lore are the survivors of the previous Warhammer world who fled to this one to become the elven gods of the new one. It's also interesting to note that in some supplements, mention is also made of how the elves are aware of the old ones creating them and their gods, and yet they also claim that not only have their gods always existed, but that these two stories don't contradict each other. So in truth, we could be looking at anything from some elven gods being old ones, some being survivors of the old world and some being born in this setting, some not. Who knows? It's all over the place. In 40k, we have the same lovely bits of uncertainty here as we do for the mortal Eldar, where maybe their gods are old ones, uplifted by the old ones, weapons made for the Eldar they worshipped as gods and thus became gods. Pick a backstory you like and go with it. It doesn't really matter. I did just mention the High Elves repeatedly, and that's because the High Elves are the main group of elves to give praise to this side of the Pantheon. The Dark Elves despise them when they bother to acknowledge the Kadai's existence, and the Wood Elves and Wood Elf tradition are weird. They worship both sides, but in their own way, and this has an actual effect on how those gods manifest, at least for the Wood Elves themselves. By and large, though, the Kadai seem to throw themselves behind the High Elves, who in turn worship them fervently. It's also said that these gods live in the Anulii Mountains that divide the inner and outer kingdoms of Ulthuan, and apparently there was one dude who made it up there. Said dude also threw himself off a building because the experience drove him mad, so while there may be gods up there, either mortals aren't meant to see at the tops of those mountains, or they're of a more chaotic bent, as it were. Also, the goddess Lilith might live on the moon, so who knows what's what's really up there. Each of these gods do have major shrines on Ulthuan, so you don't need to risk the Death Mountain to go say hello, and of course countless other smaller shrines dot both Ulthuan and plenty of other regions of the world as well. The elven gods have been fighting chaos since time immemorial, and this is something that holds true even in 40k. Nurgle, Khorne, and Tzeentch existed before Slaanesh, which means there was overlap of some amount of time where they and the Eldar pantheon coexisted. Given that mankind didn't have too much trouble against chaos in 40k until the Age of Strife, and that they fight it more than any other pantheon than fantasy, I think it's a safe assumption, though an assumption still, that as the Eldar pantheon, they kept chaos in check until Slaanesh ate them all. Chaos only grew more and more turbulent in the lead-up to Slaanesh's birth, but at least for the Eldar, there weren't too many detrimental effects until after it happened and they got Vord, so I feel safe in putting that assertion forward. Also, it makes these gods in 40k sound cooler and like they actually did something, so even if I'm completely wrong and Assyrian spent the build-up to Slaanesh doing nothing but cranking his divine hog, I'm gonna say he was really cool. That should suffice for background, so how about we get into the meat and potatoes now. The Zeus to the rest of the Pantheon. Assyrian is the head honcho of the Kadai and the guy that even the Eldar wish was still around, if only because Chief God tends to mean you're at least a little kick-ass. He is in fact the being the High Elves named themselves after, since they call themselves the Asur. This extends to 40k as well, with the Craftworlders technically being called the Asuryani, and of course, Asurman deciding to name himself the Hand of God, because the ego is the only thing taller than his hat, apparently. Assyrian is both the ruler and a creator god of the setting, with many elves believing he was the first deity to ever grace the world. He laid the foundations for the elves to gain the culture of the High Elves, as there's some evidence and speculation that the Wood Elves is the quote-unquote natural state of the elven species. Things were alright, as they were in pre-chaos times, with no real hardship or worries to be had. Then chaos happened and all the problems that came with it assaulted the world. Assyrian was either driven off or outright killed, but fun fact, his sacred animal is the phoenix, and as I'm sure you know, phoenixes are known for being reborn anew after death. Assyrian returned to help the other gods beat the 4 Chaos gods, defeating them and driving them back, although unfortunately for everyone, not killing them. It should be noted that these events are told not by an elvish myth, but a human one, so even those of you who hate elves have to admit that lends the story some credibility. After this, Assyrian apparently saw fit to do almost nothing in his day-to-day life. His most frequent activity is mediating disputes between the other elven gods, because holy wars are all well and good until they are literal holy wars between the members of your pantheon under you. The divine paperwork that would create is the stuff of the Administratum's nightmares, I'm sure, and I like to imagine he lends a hand to other races' gods in this matter as well. If Tal and Raya are having a marital dispute, Assyrian helps them settle things, that sort of deal. In spite of what I just said, his relative inactivity should not be taken to mean he does nothing in fantasy. Keeping the gods in line is a task that no doubt requires a lot of effort, given all the clashing personalities. And much of his time spent doing nothing is him putting the pieces into place for his final plan, the winning of the Rana Dandra. It's mostly a 40k term, but the end result is the same, the final battle against chaos. In fantasy, Assyrian spends his time concocting the ultimate plan to ensure chaos is defeated forever. Even at its best, it's unclear if the elves will win, but the end results are either the complete destruction of the world or the chaos gods being cast so deep into the warp they can never again interfere with the material world. The end time showed us which side the coin landed on, as it were, but to be fair, a 50-50 shot of defeating the greatest evil ever isn't horrible. The dragons were going to go extinct one way or another in his plan, though, which sucks for them. It also makes me wonder how Cathay might be involved in that, what with them being dragons. That's newer lore, so the answers nowadays would really be GW didn't consider that, but I also imagine, like, Miao Ying being excited chaos was truly defeated and she could take a break, only for Assyrian himself to just execute her so his prophecy is still technically correct. His main shrine on Ulthuan is perhaps the most potent holy site in all of the Warhammer world. This is where the next Phoenix King of the High Elves is chosen, with their final rite being to walk into the holy flame of Assyrian, where the Big A himself will test their character. If he likes what he sees, there's a new Phoenix King. If he doesn't, that holy fire suddenly gets a lot hotter and they melt. See Malekith as evidence of that last bit. And yes, I will be ignoring the end times lore where Malekith was actually super worthy, and the entire time the High Elves were using magic to save Phoenix Kings from getting burned by Assyrian for all being unworthy. Age of Sigmar actually retconned that bit of lore, so we too can safely ignore it. Although on the subject of burning, that fire in particular is so potent that anything short of a greater demon doesn't have a chance of manifesting near it, and even named greater demons like Nakari are weakened in its presence. During the end times, Assyrian had his essence put into Malekith, as many of the elven gods did into various other elves, because as I understand it nowadays, after Aeolus tried to do some damage control, this was Assyrian taking the best shot he had in a bad situation, after Finnabar was slain and Tyrion went apeshit. He presumably died along with the rest of the world, but some of the other elven gods, chiefly Cain, have in some ways returned in Age of Sigmar. There's a decent chance that Malekith, having seemingly become at least a bit less evil in AOS, is because Assyrian's essence bringing him closer to the noble hero he once was. That, or GW just forgot about all the elf gods that aren't Cain, and for some reason, Kurnos. In 40K, meanwhile, Assyrian is still the king of the gods. It is more frequently called the Phoenix King, since he doesn't have to share that title with a mortal Eldar. He has the same general backstory of all the Eldar gods, i.e. he could be an old one, or an Eldar warp creation that became a god, or a pre-existing god that grew to power in the warp as the Eldar did in real space. Who needs a single solid explanation for that when we can just say it's a time lost to myth and legend, and then release more Primarch novels without a single hint of appreciation for the irony in that action? Assyrian's role was much the same, all in the case of his job of handling disputes between gods, he for some reason is infinitely worse at it here than in fantasy. Case in point, the Eldar war in heaven. The literal one between their gods, not the one with the Necrons. I'll discuss it a bit more with some of the other gods, but TLDR, Cain got a prophecy that he would be slain by the Eldar, which he responded to by attempting to kill all the Eldar. Assyrian in all things needs to remain neutral, since balance is a key aspect of his divine portfolio. So to avoid pissing anyone off more than anyone else, he simply declared no one was allowed to cross between the warp and real space anymore and completely divided the two. Ironically enough, this may have saved the entire setting, because there's a chance without this action the Chaos Gods could freely manifest in reality, but also, what the hell, man, no one but Cain was doing anything wrong here. Assyrian also decided that Cain should be allowed to torture the gods Isha and Kurnos as well after they were caught communicating across the barrier, because yes, this is well balanced. The war in heaven broke out as another god named Vol did some stuff to free Isha and Kurnos, but couldn't quite hold up his end of the deal and instead decided to try and fight Cain personally. The various other Eldar gods began picking sides, and after Cain murdered a mortal Eldar champion, Assyrian declared the matter settled and that Cain could now torment Vol forever instead of Isha and Kurnos. Phenomenal work, Assyrian. There was one asshole at fault here, and it was not any of the people being tortured by Cain, or killed by Cain. It was Cain. Cain was the asshole at fault. As much as it is infuriating his avatars keep getting no diff in lore, he does kind of deserve it for all that he's done. Assyrian died alongside the rest of the Eldar gods, or was at least devoured, since permanently killing a god isn't something often done in Warhammer if you aren't Nagash. His final act, however, was apparently boosting the psychic power of the remaining Eldar even more, particularly their future-seeing abilities, to help them survive a world without divine guidance. So in 40K, he did one decent thing before getting Vord, a fitting end to a god that in this iteration seemed to do nothing but fumble the bag every chance he got. I bet he'd be a good friend with the Emperor if he wasn't an Eldar god. They're both massive pricks with a record of success far lower than their supporters would lead you to believe. One of two elven gods I've already made a video on, since I quite like her. Her section will be shorter for it though, since I've already talked about her a good bit. Isha is a nature goddess, one of life and rebirth and things generally being nice and healthy. She is by no means harmless, as you'll soon discover, but with a few notable exceptions, the people her or her avatars have killed tend to deserve it. Isha in Warhammer Fantasy was actually doing fairly alright by the standards of both other gods in the setting and herself over in 40K. She's the wife of Kurnos and the nature goddess of the elves. The Dark Elves still ignore her and the High Elves still love her, but the Wood Elves really love her. Not only are they Wood Elves and therefore in tune with nature beyond anyone else, standard hippie crap, but they also worship her specifically as their queen. And while typically gods can't enter the mortal world, the Forest of Athel-Loren doesn't really care for your rules, because as Queen Ariel, Isha can in fact enter the mortal world. This isn't the entirety of Isha. Gods are tricky things, and so even though this is an avatar of Isha in many ways, it isn't the entirety of her power, spirit, or even personality. But it is still an avatar of the goddess Isha, and it is as powerful as that sounds. Ariel is a nature queen, but nature in the sense of a wild bear mauling you is still part of nature. She is by and large benevolent, but she's a wood elf queen and therefore willing to slaughter anyone potentially harming Athel-Loren. Worse was that for a while her essence was a bit corrupted by the beastman Morgr, causing her to go from occasionally incredibly violent to always incredibly violent. That bit of ick was mostly purged out of her though, so she's back to normal Azrai levels of murderous insanity. As Isha is a goddess of healing in nature though, even as Ariel she's a good sort. Even when she was a bit corrupted, her efforts were focused on harming the enemies of Athel-Loren. It's just that her efforts cause as much harm to the wood elves in the forest as they did everyone else. For the most part, she's just helping crops grow, making sure kids grow up healthy. That's that sort of thing. Curing diseases too. She's a kind soul. She's got another sort of avatar in the form of the High Elf Everqueen as well, which is a composite soul of part of Isha's essence as well as the rest of the previous Everqueens jammed into the latest one. There's a lot of fertility rituals going on for low-key stuff since elf birth rates are low on account of me not being on Ulthuan. There's also a ritual to stop the moon Morsleib from crashing into the world, which is technically Isha being a real pal since that's an Everqueen ritual. In the end times, all the various bits of Isha finally coagulated into Alarielle's essence, making her stronger to fight off the encroaching hordes. Didn't work, of course, but it does mean by technicality, Isha is alive in Age of Sigmar. Alarielle's a bit all over the place in a lot of ways, so her simultaneously wanting intense isolation but also being willing to go out and help the mortal realms might be Isha's different aspects as well as her own soul being in conflict. Over in 40K, Isha's suffering is eternal and never ends. The Eldar War in Heaven has no complete fantasy equivalent, perhaps in part because everyone is a bit more on top of their game over there. In 40K, Cain got the prophecy that the Eldar would kill him, so he decided to kill all the Eldar, like I said before. Isha is a mother goddess to the Eldar race, which means Cain was going around killing her kids. An Assyrian solution to this was to just lock off the realms, which did stop the killing, but also meant Assyrian walked up to a mother and said you could never see or speak to your children ever again. So she got sad because, yeah, no shit, and eventually her and her husband figured out a way to talk to their kids. This was breaking Assyrian's rule, so she got tortured by Cain for an undisclosed amount of time, but I presume it was a while. Val did technically achieve his goal of freeing her and Kurnos, but this was after a war amongst the gods and Cain being more of a dick, which to once again remind you, was not at all Isha's fault. She would then continue on as all the other gods did and reign supreme over the Immaterium until Slaanesh ate everyone. She, however, was not included in that list because Slaanesh was spared not by Slaanesh, god no, but by grandfather Nurgle himself. Be it because he also simps for elves or because her despair was so potent it was practically steroids for him, he charged Slaanesh to save her and succeeded. She now lives in his garden where he tests diseases on her, since as a life goddess they can't kill her and he can study the effects. In turn, she whispers cures to the mortal world, be it to Eldar or other races, doing what she can to weaken the Plague Father. Once a group of Eldar Farseers tried to save her, and their crystalline corpses are a new source of anguish for her after the attempt failed. It really sucks to be 40k Isha. As a final semi-related note, I wish everyone who seriously wants Isha to be saved by Leman Russ a very explode. We've already got enough Primarchs, and while I know he'll be back in 40k eventually, we don't need them power scaled to Chaos God levels. Let the Eldar save the Eldar goddess, thank you very much. Kurnos is the male Elfdar god of the hunt in nature. He's one of those gods with limited similarities between 40k and fantasy, but this is largely because his role in 40k was to get tortured and then die, whereas in fantasy, he's technically a playable model on the tabletop. In fantasy, Kurnos amongst the High Elves is worshipped primarily in the regions of Illyrian, Averlord, and Krace. Those are the wilder regions of Ulthuan, or at least the ones more in tune with nature, so giving some prayers his way is a smart move. He's a fairly chill god on the High Elf side of things. Give respect to the prey you kill, don't take more than you need, or at least use all of the animal, that kind of thing. There's still a story about Cain torturing him a bit over a bow gifted to Kurnos that Cain really wanted because it was forged by Vol and Lilith, but that wasn't the eternal torment he went through compared to 40k. In the Wood Elf realms, meanwhile, he's one of their chief gods of worship. Once again, not surprising, considering that for over half the year you could theoretically have a meeting with the guy. Check Bretonnian wine stocks, discuss how many peasants need to be slain with the Treeman shareholders, that kind of deal. Also, as is well known by this point, in Total War he looks like Mel Gibson. Not entirely sure why, but it is funny. Every spring, a chosen Wood Elf is taken to the Oak of Ages itself to be sculpted by Ariel into the demigod of the hunt Orion. When this happens, the wild hunt begins. The Wood Elves, chiefly young and aggressive ones, as well as the wild riders of Kurnos, exit Athelorn to bring low the enemies of the forest. What exactly enemy of the forest entails is sometimes tricky to figure out, but there is a simple way to determine if someone could potentially qualify. If you are not a Wood Elf, you are not safe. Humans, be they Bretonnian, Empire, Chaos, Dwarfs, non-Wood Elves, all of them are potential targets of the wild hunt. In this way does it further expand the reasons being a Bretonnian is awful, because sometimes the elves next door decide to rampage through your hometown on stags and unicorns. Come winter, he dies as part of the natural life cycle of the forest, because the Wood Elves have their bit and they're sticking to it like glue. Alongside winter being the cause, Orion's death heralds the forest of Athelorn calming down. The Wood Elves remain within it to defend their home, while the spirits of the forest rest for the season, and everyone nearby can breathe a sigh of relief that they've got at least 3 months of not being hunted for sport. Come spring, Orion is once again born anew, and the cycle continues on as reliable as the seasons. He might also be related to or be the human god Tal, as both of them are frequently depicted as a fellow with a stag for a head. It's happened before in Warhammer, with Osirian and Mor being the same death god, as was proven by Nagash eating Osirian and Mor just vanishing. Maybe it's true here too. It's also hardly the first time a human god was actually an elf god, you dumb Bretonnian pricks. In the end times, Orion actually had a little bit of Sanguinius in him. After Tyrion pulled the Sword of Cain and did what any incarnation of Cain does best, killing elves, Orion managed to deepen a hole in Tyrion's armor and wound him through it a bit. Orion was then killed, as was Kurnos alongside him, but this did help with Tyrion's eventual defeat as part of the elf storyline. Not the most dramatic of things, especially since Durthu would shortly afterwards punt Tyrion across the horizon Team Rocket style, but hey, that's about the best hit Kurnos has ever gotten on Cain. Kurnos has sort of returned in Age of Sigmar, however. The elf gods are at least sometimes capable of reincarnation. This was most prominent with Cain, but a little bit of Kurnos seems to have come back as well. Alarielle, when she returned, has not only created a sort of consort named Kurnoth, but has his essence in a spear she keeps, since Kurnoth was originally slain when Chaos first invaded the setting. And for once, the name change in Age of Sigmar is actually appropriate, as Alarielle likely separated some of Kurnos' essence out of Kurnoth. Kurnoth is the nice nature bits as well as the honorable hunter aspects, making him a pretty standout guy. Unfortunately, this turned into a Kami and Piccolo situation, as the darker aspects were banished but have steadily been regaining some power and corrupting local Sylvaneth around the area it's located in. Alarielle has tried to stop this, but Dark Kurnoth, or whatever you want to call him, is still forming and not chaotic. It's a scary evil nature god in the making, but compare that to the entirety of Nurgle's forces invading Gyron, and you can't really blame her for not having this on top of her priority list. And then we have 40K, where he sure is present. As Isha's husband, he's technically the father of the Eldar, and was sad alongside his wife for the understandable reason of not being able to talk to his kids. He was tortured alongside Isha for quite some time until the Eldar war in heaven, where Val took his place, and then it was time for Slaanesh to be born and Kurnos to end up in her gut. He does seem to have some worship left for him, however, as aside from the Craftworlders having some shrines to their gods, the Harlequins in Dawn of War will actually mention how they're Kurnos' hounds sent to hunt. That'd be a really cool development to match the return of the Primarchs, as some aspects of the Eldar gods return to various parts of their species. Doubt it'll happen, but who knows. Maybe one day we'll get an Exodite army, and through webway portals across the galaxy, the lesser races will learn to fear the Horn heralding the Wild Hunt. You ever meet someone you just want to give a hug to? That's Vol. I want to give this guy a bear hug and a beer, because he really deserves it. Vol is the elf god of craftsmanship, or crafts-elfship as it were. While this applies mostly to weapons of war given the setting, he's also an artisan god, and so an elven painter or an Eldar sculptor would pray to him for inspiration as well. I'll do 40k first for him, because for reasons I'll get into, his story is really funny in a sad way if I lay it out that way. Vol in 40k is an Eldar god, so old ones, war in heaven, yada yada yada, all that jazz. While I'm unsure if he had any immediate reaction to Osirian declaring the warp and real space separate, he is Isha's brother and was naturally at least a bit receptive to her plight. So on the down low, we helped forge the spirit stones that allowed her and Kurnos to speak to the Eldar. Cool guy right there. And when they were captured, he could have gotten away scot-free. Presumably this was all on technicalities, but Vol wasn't the one breaking the barrier between the worlds. He made it possible, but he didn't do anything, and you can hardly fault a craftsman for crafting. But then he continued being a stand-up guy and spoke to Osirian on their behalf, demanding they be freed from Cain's clutches and that their punishment in no way fit the crime. He bargained with Cain for their freedom and struck a deal. If Vol could forge 100 swords within a year, Isha and Kurnos could go free. And to Vol's credit, he got to work. Non-stop he toiled in his forges, creating wondrous weapons each greater than the last. He made 99 before he realized that the final day was here and he couldn't complete the task, and so he slipped in a normal mortal blade amongst the pile. Best case scenario, Cain never even notices. Worst case scenario, he, Isha, and Kurnos can run like hell before Cain realizes what happened. The latter version occurred, unfortunately, but it did give Vol time to forge that 100th sword better than the rest and take the fight to Cain himself, which did not work out for Vol. Vol was defeated, and after Cain murdered the Eldar hero Uldanesh, Osirian declared the issue resolved and Vol to be chained to his forge eternally working for Cain. And then Slaanesh happened, and you know the rest. His influence nowadays is largely in his remaining creations, the most well-known being the Blackstone fortresses, which are to the Eldar called the Talismans of Vol. Whether or not he truly made them is up in the air, there, but I choose to believe he did. In fantasy, you might think that his story is much like the rest of the elf versions of these gods, and that his life is better. It isn't, it's just as bad. The war in heaven never happened, but there was still early on a war amongst the gods where Vol challenged Cain himself. On behalf of Lilith and Kurnos this time did it happen, but the outcome was the same. Vol was blinded and forced to work for Cain, although I believe in this version of things this was just Cain being a prick rather than replacing previous torture victims. Vol hates Cain, but toils regardless, because while he forges weapons of war far more often than he'd like, he knows the High Elves need him and his blessings. He does a lot of work, but his most known creation is the Widowmaker, the Sword of Cain. Forged in the heat of the first dragon's fire, this sword is a monster. It corrupts all who wield it, and curses their very bloodline, but it allows a mortal to challenge greater demons with impunity and probably the gods themselves. It's a weapon of unparalleled power, and its corrupting influence drives the story of not only the elven race, but Tyrion, Teclis, and of course Malekith specifically. All three of the elven races, at least in the Total War continuity, have a forge dedicated to Vol specifically, because even though the Wood Elves prefer nature and the Dark Elves the outright malicious gods, all of them know a good weapon is a good idea. In the end times, it was revealed that his incarnation amongst mortals was a Wood Elf named Lord Daith, who was sure enough a blind elven craftsman building wondrous artifacts. Probably could have told you that one without a big reveal. And I don't think off the top of my head he's still around in AOS. He might be, or hey, maybe that'll come up in a Lumineth book, but I'm unsure at the moment. For a potential bit of semi-crossover, however, consider the Widowmaker again. The most legendary of blades crafted by Vol, of immense power but also immense misery and despair. We don't know what happened to that 100th sword, but it's said to be the strongest amongst the ones he made for Cain in 40K. It isn't a crone sword, so it's safe from the Ynnari plotline, but there is a character whose hands it may have fallen into instead, Commander Farsight. Farsight wields a blade that is clearly supernatural in origin, strength, and abilities, cutting through damn near anything and adding the lifespan of those killed to its wielder. If I may present you a theory, the Widowmaker in 40K would be incredibly old. Some of its power may have been lost over the eons, or failing that, it can only truly be wielded in the hands of an Eldar, similar to how in Total Warhammer only elves can draw the Sword of Cain. Perhaps with more slaughter, or in the right hands, the Dawnblade of Farsight will be reforged into the Widowmaker once more, and a new cursed reign of terror will begin in the galaxy. Every family has a black sheep, right? Well, to the Kadai, that's Mithlan. He's the elven god of the sea, and I really think that sums up most of what you gotta know about him. Sea monsters, hurricanes, tsunamis, all of those are his domain. In a neat twist of fate, however, he's perhaps the only Warhammer ripoff of history, mythology, or other media that's less brutal than the real-life version, because unlike Poseidon, I don't believe Mithlan ever did unspeakable things to a priestess and another goddess in her own temple. So he's got that going for him. The reason he's the black sheep is in large part because he's a sea god. The High Elves are the greatest sailors in the setting, but the ocean is still the ocean. Things go wrong at sea, and it's easy to view Mithlan as a fickle, cruel god even if he didn't necessarily screw you over. Sometimes the ocean is just brutal, whether or not he's involved. He can be fickle and cruel to be sure, but I'd say the blame is a bit overblown. There are some neat legends about him beyond the obvious, however. There's a group of elf gods called the Elinili, the surviving children of one named Elilnil, who survived being killed by him. Some say he's one of those children, although others say that's either just a mere legend or a ruse, and that he has 100 faces he can swap between freely. The High Elves of Kothik love him since they love sailing and exploring, with those in the city of Lothern also being at least amicable towards his worship, as they're the chief trading city of the High Elves. The rest view him with suspicion and fear, but he's a Kadai, so if nothing else he isn't distrusted as much as someone like Cain. The Dark Elves, particularly the Corsairs, also like him, as they like to engage in seaboard trade as well. That trade is the slave trade, granted, but hey, that still requires sailing, and it's not like the Dark Elves care about being evil. As for the Wood Elves, I don't think they really care. They live in a forest. I'm sure there's some shrines to him out of respect, but based on location alone, out of every god to care about, he's pretty low on the list. As you may expect for him as well, he doesn't have a 40K incarnation. As a sci-fi setting, it does make some sense, since the ocean isn't big compared to the endless vacuum of space, but I figure they could at least make the attempt. Space is always compared to the ocean anyways, he could be a god of that metaphorical sea as well. There is some spice with him in AOS, however. During the end times, his avatar was Aisland the Sea Lord, a high elf who I can never tell if I'm supposed to say his name like Ashlyn, since that's a spelling of it, or Aisland because it sounds elfier. I go with Aisland, but you know, I'm hardly an expert on English. Anyways, Aisland was one of the many killed by Tyrion, though with his final dying breath, the avatar of Mithlan sunk half of Tyrion's fleet to give give his opponents a chance. He had also split off a bit of his power, and with it created magical seashells to hide just a few elves of the end of the world. It didn't work, but many of those elves would go on to become none other than the Ident Deepkin in Age of Sigmar, explaining how they took to the seas so easily. These new elves tried to pray to Mithlon, but he was dead, so it didn't really do anything. They did have some success in recreating his power through elemental magic, however, creating the Eidolons of Mithlon by way of arcane might and the spirits of deceased Ident Deepkin to form a visage of the sea god. Perhaps he will come back one day, as the elven gods are damn near eternal, but until that day, though we may not be around, his image still brings ruin to the foes of those that dwell within the deepest of seas. What a fun little barrel of retcons and tomfoolery this goddess is. I'll touch on that in a bit though, because for now we'll start with what she is. Lilith is the goddess of dreams, prophecy, and magic. Also innocence and fortune, but she seems to really drop the ball on those two latter bits. In Warhammer Fantasy, Lilith lives on the moon Manslieb, the nice normal moon compared to the giant warpstone abomination that is Morslieb. Supposedly a few different goddesses do, and the moon Empress of Cathay also comes from there, but Lilith is to me the most important one to live on the moon. Lilith in Warhammer Fantasy is an interesting little goddess, and in fact I think I might as well just get into that retcon nonsense now. Prior to the end times, there were heavy hints that the Lady of the Lake was really the goddess Ladriel, the elven goddess of mists and illusions and that sort. If there was going to be a goddess lying about things, it would be that kind of one. Then we cut to the end times, and there's the big reveal. Ladriel is merely a single guise of Lilith, not her own full-blown goddess. This naturally caused some outrage because, oh look, GW just retconning more stuff again. There they go. That being said, in the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay supplement Tomes of Salvation, Lilith is oftentimes worshipped as a servant of the goddess Myrmidia, if not outright a guise of the goddess herself. So Lilith actually being someone else isn't an end times exclusive thing. Whether or not that pisses you off is of course up to you, but Lilith potentially being other people does at least have some pre-end times precedent. Lilith in fantasy has a habit of intervening in the mortal world more often than the other gods. She appeared to Alariel as a kid, for instance, giving her a powerful magical artifact. Alethanar's bow supposedly comes from her as well, and of course Teclis's magical staff is another gift from her, complete with a bust of her on top that also shows her own prominent bust, as it were. Which, to be fair, I get trying to make a pass at Teclis. Aside from whatever's going on with that, she's an all-around good goddess, helping the High Elves survive in the terrible world of Warhammer and doing her best to keep things afloat. All High Elves happily pray to her, but since magic is part of her divine portfolio, mages naturally like her more than others. And then we hit the end times and she decided to cosplay as Tzeentch. Aside from the Lady of the Lake stuff, she stabs Ariel with a magical shard of ice to get her killed, which leads to Alariel consuming her essence or whatever the hell happened there, and basically all of the manipulative shit Teclis was getting up to was also at least partially her doing. She outright tells what I presume to be her favorite wood elf Araloth she has no plans to save the Warhammer world, instead revealing all those Grail Knights exist to be the guardians of the next one, with some chosen elves as the gods. But, well, Manfred happened. Even before the end times finished, he'd already destroyed one world, selling out Lilith's new realm to Be'lakor and dooming it. Lilith lost contact with the world, and by this point she had passed on her power and divinity, she got to feel all the fun angst and guilt over causing so many people to die for nothing. Then the world blows up and we get no Age of Sigmar news from her yet. That's what you get for trying to be a schemer and not a happy-go-lucky magical girl like Sailor Moon Lilith. Shoulda tried being nice. As for 40K, she's, as with most of these gods, a background character. She supposedly gave the mortal Eldar things like joy and youthful boldness, which is neat mythology stuff, but hardly world-shaking events. That being said, I would bet given her portfolio, her technical status as the sister of the Eldar race, and because the Elder gods for a bit could go to the mortal world, that Lilith was a pretty chill person to hang out with. I imagine at least a couple thousand Eldar got the chance to grab some lunch with her or something one afternoon. Not confirmed, will never be confirmed, but she seems like the kind of goddess to do something like that and chill with you. She did ruin things a bit with the prophecy of Cain's death, however. For some reason I can't understand, it seems that when she made or received the prophecy that Cain would die by mortal Eldar hand, she went right to him, or made it a public announcement. Rather than going to her parent gods, or Asurian, or literally anyone else, she goes straight to the guy who's known for murder and being a colossal asshole. So way to go on that front, Lilith. Prior to Slaanesh, you were likely the cause of the most Eldar deaths since the War in Heaven. I hope you're proud. Then Slaanesh happened, of course. Nowadays, the most influence she has is that the Eldar call their maiden worlds Lilithan worlds in her honor. A nice way to remember a fairly nice goddess, if one that really needs to learn who to go to with bad news. The god of wisdom, knowledge, and progress. I'll spoil things right now and say that he doesn't appear to exist in 40k. That said, given that wisdom, knowledge, and progress aren't exactly in common supply over in the 41st millennium, I'm sure you could guess that already. Hoeth is by and large considered to be one of, if not the most benevolent gods the High Elves have. Legends say that one of his first actions was to gift the High Elves a large portion of the knowledge they have, and of course any further breakthroughs often come about from a little bit of divine inspiration courtesy of Hoeth. There are some who say that this isn't necessarily a good thing, as unchecked progress breaks with tradition, but they're in the minority of things since the elves aren't dwarfs. Assyrian himself apparently agrees with the latter interpretation because he burned down a bunch of Hoeth's library as revenge for his gifts, but as was discussed earlier, Assyrian has at least one miss for every hit and is a dick. Hoeth is the god most worshipped by scholars, of course, but also mages. That might seem initially confusing since Lilith is the goddess of magic, but I do have a theory to present for this. Lilith is the goddess of magic and naturally good at using it, but she might be interpreted as more a source of magic. She ensures you can use magic because it's present, and that it mostly won't explode on you, as Warhammer magic tends to do. Hoeth, however, is the guy you pray on how to actually use the magic in a logical way. He's the god with all the knowledge which would extend to knowledge on how to perform a certain ritual or cast a particular spell. He's the one you pray to for instructions, essentially, which may sound reductive, but magic is a hell of a thing. Divine inspiration on how to cast a spell can be the difference between rendering your enemies asunder and rendering your enemies a supper for them to all enjoy. This has resulted in the High Elf Kingdom of Sapphire practically being a giant temple to Hoeth. For that matter, the White Tower of Hoeth, where High Elf mages and of course the Swordmasters of Hoeth train, is named after the guy. It's a place where magical books act as computers, and there's so much knowledge inside of it that no one has ever explored the whole thing. It isn't quite as developed as the Empire's own colleges of magic lore-wise, but I'd bet good money it's a damn sight better than those are. Warriors pray to Hoeth too, for that matter. The Swordmasters and Loremasters of Hoeth are the best warriors the High Elves have, short of those either blessed by a god like the Phoenix Guard or characters like Tyrion. They train so rigorously with their swords that the weight of their eyelashes is taken into account when they strike, and they can deflect arrows, bullets, and even weaker artillery fire with their blades. They're no slouch and act as the High Elf versions of witch hunters. Knowledge, after all, is neither inherently peaceful or warlike, good or evil, and when they receive the knowledge that a particular noble of the High Elves is actually a Druchii in disguise, you can bet your ass that they're going to ensure they don't taint Ulthuan for long. Our final Cat-Eye god, though not the final god we'll discuss, because this guy, though having no direct equivalent in 40k, may in fact be another Eldar god. And I'm sure you can immediately guess who, because Loic is the elven god of dance and song, but also of tricks and laughter. Loic is a rather strange one given that portfolio. On the one hand, as a god of laughter and dance, his chief worship is at festivals and parties. Not ragers, but a fun carnival or a ballroom gala. Most High Elves worship him as such, and while not the god you necessarily pray to guide you to victory, he's the kind of god who when you get his blessing, you just have a good time. He's the god of making you laugh so hard your stomach hurts, which I'm sure anyone can appreciate worshipping. But as the god of tricks and deception, he's also worshipped primarily by Nagaroth shadow warriors. You know, those High Elves that forget they aren't Night Lords. You may have heard someone describe a character in a book as dancing around in combat, avoiding blades like nothing, or dancing through the shadows. This is the way the shadow warriors worship Loic. They dart in and out of the shadows with his blessings, bringing ruin to all enemies of the High Elves, but chiefly the hated Druchii. They are bloody, brutal warriors that give no quarter, and in the guise of worship they give him, Loic can be a god that supports some of the most violent and cruel acts in the setting. The war dancers of the Wood Elves also worship him in particular, which given that they're the Azrai, I can probably leave it at just that. The Wood Elves are insane, and so at least for them, Loic is also insane. Loic supposedly is the most proactive god in saving the souls of the elves as far as Slaanesh is concerned, frequently dancing his way right up to her and yanking an elf's soul out of her grasp. It does weaken him, but not enough that he can't either recover or keep soldiering on regardless. And in case the 40k equivalent to him wasn't clear, allow me to recap. We have an elf god whose divine domains are laughter, dancing, and deception. His worshippers in part consist of a unit that dances their way across the battlefield and killing enemies while they hit the meanest grit he ever seen. And he saves souls directly from Slaanesh. Have you figured it out yet? The Laughing God, the first and greatest fool, Honk God, a true silly goober leading his silly goober followers. Kegarak is of course the Eldar god of laughter, deception, trickery, mockery, and the Harlequins. He's not only quite the old bastard even by god standards, but is the sole remaining alive, whole, and free Eldar god. Isha is in Nurgle's garden, Cain is about a million different pieces across the universe, and Iniad is both not formed and part of the Inari plotline, which is going nowhere fast. He's a cruel god in many ways, always happy to bring down those who are too proud of themselves, and even beyond that, playing tricks is something you can do on good or evil characters. One of his first acts was to trick the Catan into devouring themselves alongside his Harlequins, and ever since he's guarded the Eldar at least as much as he puts whoopee cushions under their seats. Not kind, at least not without an agenda, but usually helpful. And that said, in recent times he has devoted himself almost entirely to fighting Slaanesh. When she was first born, he either wasn't present for the event or was hiding behind everyone else and ran like hell when she was born, which in either case is a pretty wise move. Ever since he, much like his counterpart Loic, has fought Slaanesh for the soul of every Harlequin to be claimed by her, and while his track record isn't quite 100%, it's a damn sight higher than 0. Kegarak is said to walk amongst his mortal followers without them knowing, and perhaps even directly fight the enemies of the Eldar himself. He could be anywhere and everywhere, and you'd best be careful intruding into the webway. If the Harlequins don't get you, he damn well might. He's given Lady Malice his heart after she beat him in a contest of riddles, and for those of you who have been screaming at the monitor this entire video wondering where the Space Marines are, well don't you worry, jingle jangle, here are those keys you've been waiting for. Kegarak, for reasons known only to himself, swapped where Jagatai Khan and Fulgrim ended up. Presumably this was to somehow ensure the Khan never fell to chaos, as since he's already fast and Slaanesh is all about speed, Lord only knows how quickly he'd blitz the galaxy with her help. And in the Black Library lies a crystal tome whose bindings of light have finally all withered away. Within it is supposedly one last joke, one last prank you will pull that will see Slaanesh expend all of her power to save the Eldar race. Perhaps it's Iniad, perhaps Kegarak will somehow cause warp shenanigans to make an attack she does hit herself, or maybe he'll just zap her with a giant joy buzzer and she'll explode. The possibilities are limitless with only one caveat. It has to be incredibly funny. And those were the cat-eye gods of the elves and somewhat the Eldar, with a special guest appearance from a clown. Mostly good, a bit evil, but each one of them through and through is dedicated to opposing chaos and the worst bits of the world wherever they may make their home. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the cat-eye to my elves and Eldar, raising me up in this miserable little world we all live in. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Alright, so you're 6 inches deep in Isha, but Kurnos is 6 inches deep in you. Which way you moving? Personally, I don't know what to do there, so I'd probably start screaming and rotating like a Beyblade as hard as I possibly can. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, and I hope you enjoyed reading this essay as much as I enjoyed writing it.